Welcome back to Peking Hotel. I'm your host, Leo. Have you ever wondered how the Chinese Communist Party rose to power, got rid of the Chinese Nationalist Party, and founded the People's Republic? Well, for a long time, the dominant answer within academia had been that the Chinese Communist Revolution, which resulted in the founding of the PRC, was a product of an indigenous agrarian movement that united the country against imperialist forces and defeated the corrupt nationalists to usher in a new era of politics. And yet, Professor Dikötter, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and chair professor of humanities at Hong Kong University, just published a new book busting this myth. And it shows that it's in fact a combination of Soviet operations, the exhaustion of the KMT army by the war with the Japanese, and the American exit from China post-Second World War that drove the CCP to power post-Second World War. So in this first episode of a two-part series, we discussed the early Soviet operations in China that founded and sustained the Chinese Communist Party despite its abysmal popularity. And we jointly produced this episode with JF Pod, a Chinese show that I host with JF Books in Washington, D.C., and you will find the Chinese version there. So with that, enjoy this new episode with Professor Dikötter. Welcome to the podcast, Frank Dikötter. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
It's amazing that you've written yet another book on Chinese history. You write books often faster than people can read.
Well, that's not entirely true, but you have to remember this is pretty much all I do. It's a full-time job, really. And it's a passion as well, and that helps.
Well, I think the passion certainly comes through. So tell us, why one more book on the history of Chinese Communist Party, and why this period from basically 1920s all the way to 1949?
It's really a COVID book, so you have to think as a historian in terms not just of a topic, but of primary sources. So if you have good primary sources, the book will write itself, which is why, you think I'm productive. I don't think it's really all that difficult. The story tells itself if you have a good collection of material. So the question was, with COVID, what can I do? Because I was in Hong Kong at the time. I spent a good, 15 years going across the border into the archives of the People's Republic of China, and then, of course, the whole border came down. We were all locked up, not quite in Hong Kong, but at least locked into Hong Kong. Couldn't cross the border. The question is, what can I do? So I started dabbling around in sources we have in Hong Kong, and I came across this extraordinary collection, up to 300 volumes, of material that was archival material that was collected and published from 1981 to 1988 by the Central Archives in Beijing in collaboration with the Provincial Archives. And it was all on material from the Communist Party from roughly 1923-4 all the way up till roughly 47-48. Some 300 volumes just for the Dongbei, for Manchuria. There are about 70 volumes in there. An extraordinary amount of material. I read through some of it, and I thought, this is good enough. So it was here in Hong Kong, and it corresponded to, if you wish, a desire to go back and revisit those decades from 1921 to 49. You got to remember, I did work on the Republican era for the first 15 years or so of my career, and Then I crossed into the People's Republic. So this was sort of going back into familiar terrain, so to speak.
Yeah. What's special about this period that attracted you? I mean, especially from an academic, intellectual point of view. I mean, to me, right, this question of the origin of the Chinese Communist Revolution, that was a question that's quite hot in the American academia in the 40s and the 50s when John Fairbank debated with Fogel about, was it the Soviet, was it about the Soviet influence and the Soviet Union setting up the Chinese Communist Party? Was it about, the Communist Revolution being a self-contained, indigenous, self-originating kind of revolution that's coming from a agrarian, reformist energy in China? I mean, that seems to be like a old debate that was long settled or long discussed, and suddenly now you're reopening the Pandora box.
I did think, do I still have an interest in the Republican era? Because, as you said, so much has been debated and apparently settled. So what I did was download a primary source on my Kindle, and it was a book written by John Powell, a journalist who spent decades in China. The title is My 25 Years in China. And it's an extraordinary book because it's obviously very easily available. You don't have to make much of an effort. You just have to pay your fee and you can get it on your computer. And in that book, John Powell travels everywhere. And there's one chapter on what he refers to as a war between Manchuria, basically the Beijing government, in 1929, and the Soviet Union. It's called the 1929 Sino-Soviet War. Now, frankly, I had not really heard of it. I had some vague inkling that something had happened. And we're talking really about hundreds of thousands of troops. Stalin sends his very best marshal. We're talking about, gunboats, airplanes, towns completely destroyed, massacre of civilians. Think Ukraine, right? Except that it was a lot shorter. Now, I Googled this conflict, and there was one book written on it called The 1929 Sino-Soviet Conflict by a man called, I believe, Michael Walker. My memory isn't all that great. Now, it was published in 2017. I was doing all of this research during COVID 2020. It was only 3 years difference. In the introduction, the author says that very few historians of modern China have actually noticed this particular conflict. So I verified that by going through all the mainstream books on modern history written by Europeans, Americans, not least, of course, some of the people you mentioned, John King Fairbank, very little mention of it at all. So it occurred to me, rather than all of these debates having been settled for the Republican era, there were huge events that are entirely missing. The 1929 Sino-Soviet War is just one of them. There's a whole series of them. The raid on the Soviet embassy carried out in 1927, I believe it was April, and discovering vast amounts of Soviet material is known but hardly mentioned. The Nanjing incident, in which troops led by communist commissars during the Northern Expedition massacre several high-flying Europeans and force Europeans to intervene in Nanjing. This is March 1927, barely mentioned at all. So I thought this period really should be read not from the point of view of secondary sources, but really from the point of view of the primary sources. Let the primary sources guide the inquiry. That's my bottom line, and in fact has always been my approach. The secondary sources create a sort of ivory tower, and you have to remember, with all due respect to the historians who worked in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they were working in circumstances which were not exactly ideal. One could not just travel to the People's Republic of China to consult archives. There was very little material available. So a lot of it revolved not so much around the examination of evidence, but rather a particular ideological point of view. And it occurred to me that a lot of that ideological point of view, not least the one proposed by Fairbank and his followers, was rather sympathetic to the communists. Although what any reader of primary sources will discover when reading something about the communists in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s is that they were quite brutal and quite violent. towards other people and towards each other.
So how about let's talk about some of the myth-busting new finds that you have discovered, and the most interesting ones that are to you, and then we can dive into the narrative of the book and the different periods. But how to just share some inklings of the flavor of the book and the most interesting finds.
Well, the most important find is not exactly rocket science. I mean, a lot of this, if you were to discount those 300 volumes, which I and students here at Hong Kong U work through, if you were to discount them, then a lot of the evidence was there in plain sight anyway. But so what really took me aback is something we all know, but we don't really, I think, take into account sufficiently. And that is when you look at the membership of the Chinese Communist Party from 1921, when it is established, as you know, in Shanghai. There are about a dozen chaps in that room, including several Soviets, and it is set up entirely under the guises of the Comintern, the Communist International. And it is very much a Comintern envoy from the Netherlands, Henk Snevely, you know, in Dutch, who very much arranges that meeting and finds it very difficult because the 57 members of the Chinese Communist Party that are represented by this dozen delegates squabble and find it very difficult to agree on anything. So within a few years, this Communist Party attracts no more than a few hundred, until the Soviets, including Lenin, realize that communism has very little appeal. They must create a united front, which is realized in 1923-24, as you know, when the Soviet Union starts subsidizing the Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai-shek, on the condition that Communist Party members are allowed inside the ranks. So you could call this the Trojan horse, really. So we can talk about that later on. But the key point I'm trying to make is that at no point, all the way until 1940, do the communists represent anything but a mere fraction of the population. So I can give you a few numbers. I've rehearsed them a few times here and there. But I think the most important, the most important one is probably 1936. So you might say, well, that's unfair because that's the end of the so-called Long March, which is basically a long defeat. But that point, really, the Communist Party has about 40,000 followers in a country that is the size of Europe and counts about 500 million people. So we're talking really 1 out of 8,000 people in China is a follower of communism. It's not exactly very impressive. If you look roughly the same sort of years, 1934 to 1936, if you look at Finland, where the Communist Party is banned, 1 in 700 people is an underground follower of communism. If you look at a fascist, yes, it's nothing. If you look at a fascist country, say Portugal, so I don't know exactly about Italy under Mussolini or Spain under Franco, but for Antonio Salazar, we have the numbers in 1934 as 1 in 280 people. 1 in 280 is a communist, as opposed to 1 in 8,000 in the Republic of China. So in any European country, with the exception possibly of Nazi Germany, the appeal of communism is much bigger than it is in the Republic of China. In fact, it would be very hard-pressed to find a country in which communism has less of a popular appeal. So, of course, you might say, well, that's only because the fascists under Chiang Kai-shek brutally repressed the communists. Well, that may be true, but quite frankly, you don't have to be a great genius to see that a small country like Finland or a fascist dictatorship like Antonio Salazar in a country like Portugal will be far more effective in repressing communism than Chiang Kai-shek could have done from Nanjing. So if you fast forward then, and then I will stop, if you fast forward to 1940, according to the numbers of the Communist International itself, which are, of course, inflated, about 1 in 1,700 people in China is a communist. And 1940, we're talking about the United Front. So you can join the Communist Party if you wish to do so. Now, that's pretty much the same as the number of followers of the United States Party of the Communist Party of the United States. I can't remember what the exact term is. I can't remember it because it's so obscure.
Socialist Party of America or something, right?
There we go. The Communist Party of America has about the same appeal in America as the Chinese Communist Party has in China in 1940. So that, to me, once you if you want to talk about the social conditions for the revolution, if you want to talk about land reform among the so-called peasants of China in the 1930s, or the appeal of the communists, and you do not take into account these numbers, really you are just wasting a lot of time. They have the same appeal as a religious sect in a province like Henan.
Yeah, well, this is great. And I think it illustrates quite well that sometimes historians, when writing stories about the past, are often writing stories about their ideologies and their projected images of the past and the present and the future, especially when evidence is lacking, or sometimes even in glaring evidence that certain images get drawn. And so when I read your book, I mean, I think the comparison on party membership figures across different countries at the same time, that's quite brilliant and really quite telling. But also we have this story of how this really obscure, tiny group of intellectuals and students, really, with some amount of foreign funding and organization, grew to become the dominating power in the biggest country in the world by population and ruling over a huge landmass. And so the puzzle is obviously there. How did they do that? And I find it quite interesting that you start your book not at the end of Qing, not at the time when October Revolution happened or Soviets sent their delegates, but in 18th century France, at the point of the French Revolution. Could you talk about why you begin the story about the origin of Chinese Communist Party in France?
Yes, I can. I mean, the reason is that you must really see that there is a modern, if you wish, way of looking at politics that appears round about, you could say, the American Revolution first, but very much also the intellectual foundations are with the French thinkers behind the French Revolution. And that approach becomes a sort of global one. And it's very straightforward. The power resides in the people, not in a king, not in an emperor. It's not granted by heaven. It's not given by a god, but resides in the people. Now, then, of course, you have a long debate about who are the people. Should women be included? Should marginalized groups be included? Should enslaved people be included? Should the serfs in Russia be emancipated? So emancipation becomes a key term throughout the 19th century. But there's something else, of course. Should that new political order be achieved through reform or through revolution? That's the entire debate. Now, of course, the key turning point, I think, for the 20th century is Lenin, when he seizes power from above in the 1917 revolution. So he's not going to wait for reform to grant equal status to workers. He's not going to be waiting for the emancipation of workers from below through reform and a legal process. He wants to have a party, a revolutionary party, that dictates the revolution from above. So he seizes power, has a monopoly over it, and then will guide it all the way through. Now, he's a great inspiration. to a number of people, including, of course, Mussolini, who was a socialist, but then becomes a fascist. Of course, all of these socialists and fascists intermingle. You got to remember that the Nazi flag is not, the background is not bred for nothing. It's a social democratic party, right? A national socialist party. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that Mussolini sees how Lenin did it and himself has a march on Rome, where he imposes his power on a very reluctant parliament. Mussolini, in turn, inspires the Nazis with the seizure of power, the Machtergreifung in German. I'm not German, I hasten to add. but it's an interesting term, Machtergreifung 1933, because, of course, in Chinese, as you well know, it is 夺权, which is a term which is so fundamental to Chinese communism. The idea that you must seize power from the class enemies and direct a revolution from above. So that is the source of inspiration for the communists, but also, should be fair to say, of the nationalists, who are themselves a revolutionary party by 1921, 22, 23, based in Guangzhou under Sun Yat-sen, as some of your listeners probably know. So that idea is a true inspiration. But the point I'm trying to make also is that the Bolshevik Revolution, while it might offer a vision of a party seizing power from above, the whole Marxist background has very little appeal. So we read in textbooks that the moment the Bolshevik Revolution appears, people in China are absolutely enraptured by what is happening. That is simply not true. The evidence is that you have to wait till 1919 for a very small number of intellectuals like Li Dazhao and Chen Yushu to be specifically approached by agents of the Comintern, established in 1919, for them to start thinking about Bolshevism and Marxism as an alternative. So it's a very small number of individuals who have been cultivated by agents from Moscow who actually lead to the establishment of the Communist Party in 1921.
Yeah, so I think that's a great place to dwell a little bit. And so I find it really fascinating the way you described these Russian activities and Russian individuals that are lying around in Republican China in the late 1910s and the early 1920s. And I was walking inside a book fair a few weeks ago, and I came across this book called Russian Fascism, in which it talked about how after the October Revolution, there was a bunch of Russian exiles who wanted to stage a fascist revolution back in Moscow. Instead of exiling in Europe, they all went to Manchuria and Shanghai, and that became their center of universe. And so they set up opera houses, they set up printing presses, set up newspapers and pubs and all kinds of places to socialize and to bide the time and wait for the day they could go back and stage their fascist revolution. And so it seems to me there's a whole Russian world in China back then, right, from now 100 years ago, and in which these Soviet agents would slot into. And so could you talk a little bit about this maybe not so underground world of Russians in China?
Yes, I can. So one thing for your readers to remember is that what I have endeavored to do in the book is not just focus on a very small number of Communist Party members. I really also try to rethink the entire Republican era. For instance, I'm not very keen on using the term warlord. I talk about regional military governors.
Right.
I'm not very keen to portray the 1920s and 30s as an era of great imperialism. In fact, I do show that subsequent governments, whether it is the Beijing government or then the Nanjing government, worked very hard at abolishing the so-called unequal treaties. And with name extraterritoriality, you will remember Hankow was returned by the Brits in early 1927, even before the end of the Northern expedition started by Chiang Kai-shek a year earlier. Then I talk about the restitution of tariff autonomy, which also takes place at the very end of the 1920s. I talk about a number of agreements signed by most imperial powers, not the Soviet Union, to relinquish all concessions within a period of 5 to 10 years. I talk about Chiang Kai-shek in a quite different light. He's actually very keen on fighting Japan, but he cannot do it overtly. This is something we could talk about later. But I also talk about very broad social trends. And one thing you do see is that after 1917, there is a massive influx, of course, of Russians into Manchuria. Harbin, of course, was already a high point for Russians as a result of the Trans-Siberian Railway and the one that runs through Manchuria. But also Shanghai is very, very interesting. In fact, not far away from Hong Kong U, there may still be an old Russian restaurant, which pretty much goes all the way back to those years, basically post-Bolshevik Revolution, right? Post-October Revolution. So that Russian presence is quite massive. And you do see large numbers of Russians arrive, in particular in Shanghai. And among them are delegates agents sent by the Comintern. And they're, of course, very keen. They are supported by what will become the Soviet embassy once the Soviet Union is recognized. Although they will be kicked out in 1927 for several years, that's a different story. But there are large numbers of them. And of course, many of them are in fact agents. So there's this fight between, if you want, so-called white Russians who are anti-Soviet and the ones sent by the Soviet Union. So this is also a reason why Manchuria is such a very complicated region, because the regional governor, Zhang Zuolin, as you know, is anti-Soviet Union. He realizes that Manchuria is a buffer zone, seen as a buffer zone by both Russia / Soviet Union and Japan. So it becomes a sort of battlefield between these two powers. And as a matter of fact, these two powers will determine the fate of the Republic of China throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. They are the ones that will start wars, the 1929 Sino-Soviet War, and needless to say, the Japanese attacking in 31, 37 again. But the point I'm trying to make is that until that Sino-Soviet War 1929, the white Russians are very helpful to Zhang Zuolin in controlling or trying to restrain the Soviet influence. That's one key point there. He's very aware of it.
So why did China matter so much to the Soviets at all, especially from such an early on age when Soviet Union in itself was hardly as stable and prosperous as it needed to be, and there you have China, all the way on the other side of Siberia, that they're already trying to cultivate, subvert, influence. I mean, is it just a warm water port, or there's more to it?
Well, there is that, but you got to remember, it doesn't start with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union continues the approach of the Russian Empire. We're basically talking about empires. There's a Russian Empire, there's a Japanese Empire, there's a Qing Empire, and there are other empires, including the French and the British, etc., and the Dutch. But so what they do is
maybe a bit less the Dutch by this point.
The Dutch were just as horrible as anyone else. They went around the globe plundering, raping, killing, like a great many of those empires, including, of course, the Qing. So the Qing are fighting, as you well know, in Vietnam against the French, and the Qing are fighting in Korea against the Japanese, as you know. Now, what is so extraordinary is that we see the defeat of the Qing in the case of both Vietnam and Korea as a sort of humiliation. But the question really is, what were the Qing doing there? What were they doing in Korea? When they prevail against Japan, I believe in 1885 as opposed to 1895, they sent Yuan Shikai, who imposes the worst kind of conditions on Korea that not even the European imperial powers have imposed on China itself. In other words, they impose several political advisors at court who make all the main decisions. They have extraterritoriality. They have preferred tariffs for trade with China. They do exactly what the imperial powers from Europe try to do in China. This the Qing does in Korea. So what is my point? My point is very simple. The Qing is an empire. They are, in Vietnam and in Korea, fighting those zones of influence like any other imperial power. They're not victims. They're perpetrators.
In many sense, the Republican China also turned more imperial as they gained into power. And so for the Soviets then, right, as part of empire building, what was China to them?
So you got to remember there is a war over Manchuria in 1904-05, the war between Japan and Russia, and the Japanese win. Now, the most extraordinary thing is that the Japanese compelled the Russians to leave Manchuria and then hand Manchuria over to the Qing on a golden plate. They could have stayed. They could have occupied the whole thing, but they handed over to the Qing, which subsequently collapses in 1911. So there's a background not just of competition and rivalry, but actually armed confrontation between the Tsarist Empire and the Japanese Empire. And this continues after the collapse of the Qing, 1911, 1912. One key point is that both of them view each other with great suspicion and are constantly afraid that Manchuria will be seized by the other. So they try to take preemptive action to prevent this from happening in the 1920s and 30s. And this will lead, as you know, to a full-fledged war in 1937.
When the Soviets came to China, and there were, various different agents of different types. Some were intellectuals, some are affiliated with the party, some are sent by Moscow. They try to cultivate different kinds of Chinese individuals. There were Chen Duxiu, there were Li Dazhou. They tried to co-opt Hu Shi, but Hu Shi never responded, and some responded better than others. I see a series of strategies by the Soviets in China. And so it seems to me that they first started with the students and the intellectuals and using this sort of more intellectual side of Marxism to appeal to this idealistic Chinese who are a bit more cosmopolitan than the rest and could buy into the anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist rhetoric. And later, they decided actually intellectuals and students are no use. And actually, what mattered is that you needed a united front. You need to cultivate power inside the KMT, the Kuomintang, be part of that political machine and try to subvert from the inside. And so you had folks like Zhou Enlai who were placed in high offices within the KMT with reference letters sent by the Kuomintang. And eventually, the Soviets and Jiang Jieshi fell out. And the Soviets decided we need our own troops. We need our own military takeover of China. The KMT is not reliable. Is that an accurate description of the series of Soviet strategies towards China?
Yes, absolutely. I think for readers who may not be fully attuned to the history of the First United Front, engineered by the Comintern. First of all, you got to understand the Comintern, to which we have referred a few times, the Communist International. It is established with the specific purpose to overthrow all capitalist governments. I mean, you got to remember the communists have their mission is a world revolution.
I mean, the communists are communists.
The communists they want a world revolution, so the Comintern is there to promote the world revolution. Now you can see that this is a pretty enormous task, right? Because in 1919, one country is communist, and that's the Soviet Union. Pretty big, I agree. So they try in 1923, in particular with Trotsky, to engineer a German revolution, which fails quite miserably.
Right.
If only because the left-leaning parties in Germany are actually in favor of reform, legal reform, reform at the ballot box, as opposed to revolution. So the German revolution, on which the Soviets had counted so much, fails in 1923. Then they turn their gaze towards China, which becomes the next sort of big hope. So the United Front is a way for Moscow to insert communists inside the ranks of the Nationalist Party. But Chiang Kai-shek, the one who will become the leader of the Nationalists, he goes to Moscow, I believe in 1923, the details are in the book. He immediately understands, it doesn't take him very long to see, he meets Trotsky, to see that the Soviets merely see China as a sort of, as a country to be used for their own purposes, So he's very reluctant on this. And then Chiang Kai-shek goes to Moscow. A mission is sent from the Soviet Union to Guangzhou, Canton, and one of the key players is Mikhail Borodin. Mm-hmm. Pretty large man, big mane, black hair. And something quite extraordinary happens. By 1927, this man is more or less in charge of a pretty large army, the army that has been set up by the nationalists in Guangzhou. There are hundreds of military advisors. They more or less control large sections of territory and military forces in China. And the mission is, of course, to overthrow the Beijing government with which they have signed a contract not to overthrow them. So it's quite an extraordinary situation. But yes, you are right. The split appears in 1927, and the Soviets are booted out of the Republic of China at the very end of 1927. So both the Beijing government and what will become the Nanjing government both turn against the Soviet Union. It's a quite extraordinary story. So what the Soviets are trying to do is more or less arm any faction that they think they can control to influence politics in the Republic of China. Now, the Japanese do something very different. They just try to get a hold of Manchuria. As you know, first 1931 and then full-fledged war 1937. But both are concerned about the relationship of what is the main power in China. So this could be Beijing before 1927, could be Nanjing afterwards. That relationship between the Republic of China and their enemy. So the Japanese are afraid of an alliance between Nanjing and Moscow. Moscow is afraid of an alliance between Beijing or Nanjing and Tokyo. Those are the geopolitics of those years.
I mean, imperialists are imperialists, and they have different aims. And within this realm of imperialist competition, it seems to me there are broadly two camps. You have the Americans, the British, the French, broadly wanting a unified China that they could trade with, that had a market, that had regular governance and operating a functioning state, and so they could conduct commerce with. That's on the one hand. And then you had, on the other hand, the Russians and the Japanese who favored the dismemberment, the breakup of China, so they could carve their own sphere of influence. Could you talk a little about this? Why different imperialist powers had different visions, and how come the Russians and the Japanese favored the breakup of China so much while the rest didn't?
Yeah, the biggest contrast is really between the Brits and then to a lesser extent some of the other European powers versus, as you pointed out very correctly, Russia / Soviet Union and Japan. And what is so interesting is that when we read, this is not in the book, I should say.
Oh.
This is not in the book, but when we read about the imperialist powers carving up China at the end of the 19th century, I think that is already somewhat of an exaggeration. When we talk about the scramble for China in the 1890s, what comes to mind is the scramble for Africa. But what happens in Africa under Leopold II in Congo, for instance, what the Germans do to the Herero, or what other imperialist powers do to large parts of Africa, bears no resemblance to what happens under the Qing during the 1890s. So what does happen is that a lot of those imperial powers want a pause, and they are afraid that the Qing cannot guarantee the safety of their own subjects in ports that they are leasing. So in other words, the imperialist powers, Germany, Italy to a lesser extent, Britain, France, they all obtain ports and the right to have people living under extraterritoriality. They're afraid that they're being attacked, so they also start placing gunboats there to protect their own nationals. Now, this is imperialism, but it's hardly the massacre of huge swathes of the population in Africa, or reducing entire parts of Africa to slave labor and extracting resources. What the Germans want, what the French want, is what the English have. And what they have is just outside here. It's Hong Kong. That's the model they aspire to. They want a German Hong Kong. They want a French Hong Kong. But beyond that, again, the Russians and the Japanese are not satisfied that for reasons that we've talked about earlier on. They want a buffer zone. They are afraid of the other seizing that territory in between, which is Manchuria. So that's the key to the dynamics between Russia and the Soviet Union and the Europeans on the other hand. But of course, the world evolves. The Qing collapses, and China has seen how Japan has been able to very rapidly, already by the end of the 19th century, Japan has been able to nullify the so-called unequal treaties. In other words, abolish extraterritoriality, claim back concessions, and gain autonomy over its own tariffs. So Japan has been able to do that in record time. And this is a real model for a variety of political groups in China. By variety of political groups, I mean the late Qing, the Beijing, Beiyang governments, then of course the nationalists themselves. So they push time and again at abolishing those unequal treaties. Now the Brits see this, the French see this, and they see a great deal of progress. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier on, by 1926, they're actually quite keen and convinced that the political progress has been such in China that they're willing to let go of these unequal treaties. So particularly important is trade. So both the Brits in particular, but also the French and other Europeans realize that you must have a united government that can actually make trade possible. So this is, after all, the only thing the Brits ever wanted. They wanted to trade equally or unequally. This goes back all the way to the Opium Wars, of course. Time and again, they want a predictable framework. The Brits do not contest the idea that the Qing dynasty has the right not to want to import or use opium. But what they do say is that this is your problem. You should check that trade. It's not our problem. In the same way that it's not up to Britain to check French trade in Manchester, etc., etc. It's not up to the French to check trade in Manchester. So what I'm trying to say is that the Brits have been pursuing a predictable legal framework within which trade can take place, and they're pushing that very hard. So with the Christmas memorandum in December 1926, the Brits proposed to let go of all of the unequal treaties in favor of trade. They're quite keen to have a unified, stable government. That's pretty much it, really.
Yeah. You make the point that Russia and Japan want this buffer zone in Manchuria, but I think clearly for the Soviets, they're not happy enough with just Manchuria. I mean, they were looking at the whole of China. They're looking at Canton, Beijing, Shanghai, Wuhan, and they're looking at China all over the place. And so I think it's clearly bigger than a buffer zone story there.
Yes, so there's two things. One is that they're not looking at Beijing and Nanjing. They're looking at Berlin. They're looking at Paris. They're looking at London. You got to remember, there is a raid on the Soviet embassy carried out by Zhang Zuolin in Beijing in April 1927, and then they seize mountains of documents which clearly show...
Remarkable story.
A remarkable story which really should at least get a paragraph or two in any standard history of that period, but is always just Li Dazhao was garroted to death is the only thing that is ever mentioned, because of course there are a great number of communist hiding inside the Soviet embassy who were seized by Zhang Zuolin and tortured to death is very unpleasant. But important as that may be, what mattered is that Zhang Zuolin now has proof that Moscow had been funding the military overthrow of the internationally recognized government of Beijing all along. The point I'm trying to make is that the Soviets have this mission of worldwide revolution. Now, the point I'm also trying to make is that the raid on the Soviet embassy in Beijing and the documents that come out of it is so important internationally that the British government, you've got to remember the widespread strikes in Britain around about 1926, that they think that the Soviets might be doing the same thing in the United Kingdom. So they, in turn, organize their own raids on the premises.
Oh, really?
Yes.
So there's a whole round of different raids of the Soviet embassies around the world. Wow.
Indeed. So this is called the Arcos affair, the all-Russian cooperative, Arcos society. There's basically a sort of pseudo-embassy in London where the Soviets do their business. It is raided, and it leads to the cessation, to the interruption of diplomatic relations, the rupture of diplomatic relationships between London and Moscow for about a year or two. In other words, this is a massive international event. Now, what I want to make 2 points. One, this raid on the Beijing embassy is hardly ever mentioned, although it gave rise to a raid in London, which is mentioned in every textbook. From a point of view of historiography, this is very interesting. But the key point is, of course, that the Russians, the Soviets, are trying to do this everywhere. So unlike the Japanese, they are concerned, the Japanese are concerned about the buffer zone, so is Moscow. But on top of that, they want to ignite a worldwide revolution. And their hope is that if you can organize it in China, if you can have a communist revolution in China, that will damage the trading interests of Britain in particular to such a point that people will appear on the streets in the United Kingdom, in London, and there will be a communist revolution there as well. In other words, they hope to create a chain of events that will lead to a worldwide revolution. That's what the Soviets are trying to do. So yes, you're absolutely right. There's more than just a buffer zone there.
Yeah, I think this is quite a remarkable story. And that takes us to the 1929 Sino-Soviet War, which I've never heard, and which I now realize is actually quite an important turning point. So could you talk about that? Both, why is it important? Why does it matter? And also, why do you think it's somewhat buried, that no one really mentions this?
Yeah, that's very interesting, because the book I mentioned earlier on by Michael Walker, published in 2017, the title is the 1929 Sino-Soviet War. The subtitle is "The War Nobody Knew." It's a very interesting subtitle, and he confirms that in the introduction, that people don't mention it. Although I also mentioned that John Powell, with a great number of other journalists, was standing on a boat on a river, I can't remember which one it is, possibly the Amur River, and describing this war to a world audience abroad. So at the time, it created a huge impact. The question was, if the Soviet Union is willing to go and fight the Republic of China in Manchuria and send well over 100,000 soldiers, which country will be next? That's the sort of question internationally. Because the idea was Lenin, Bolshevik revolution, now they're very busy with their own revolution. But no, they not only reconquer all of Siberia, but they also are at least willing to go to war with the neighboring country. So this creates a huge international sort of impact. So why did they do it? Because after the raid of the Soviet embassy in Beijing in 1927, Zhang Zuolin realizes, or his son rather, Zhang Xueliang, realizes, so Zhang Zuolin was bombed to smithereens in 1928 by the Japanese, no doubt. So 1929, his son realizes that the Soviets are using the railway to which they have a concession, the China Eastern Railway, CER, the one that runs through Manchuria, to really propagate communism and distribute their pamphlets. So he more or less arrests a great bunch of them and sends them back into Siberia and the Soviet Union. And that's the start of this war. So in other words, Zhang Xueliang is a pretty keen opponent of communism, and Stalin reacts, and he is brutal. He sends a great many troops. He crushes Zhang Xueliang and imposes his own conditions. And the interesting thing is that Stalin also thinks that by opening granaries in Manchuria, he can provoke a spontaneous revolution. This is 1929. And in order to create a spontaneous communist revolution, he wants to create a pincer movement. So you have the troops, Soviet troops in Manchuria, who try to provoke some sort of revolution. But there's also now a desire to give much greater support to the communists in the South. And he specifically names Mao Zedong as a key leader. So the idea here on the part of Stalin is that somehow he can ignite a revolution. Now, Stalin's ideas are always very keenly reflected by Mao Zedong. In particular, his saying, which appears on the 5th of January 1930, merely months after the end of the 1929 Sino-Soviet War, and that saying, you know it very well, is a single spark can set the prairie alight. A single spark will set the prairie. The idea that somehow if you just create that spark, the masses will join the revolution. So this is Stalin's idea reflected by Mao. But the result is that Mao gets recognition from Stalin and, of course, more funding. So that's 1929.
So that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you liked what you heard, please do subscribe us wherever you listen to your podcast, and also follow us on Substack. And I look forward to talking to you next time.